The Choircast podcast is brought to you by Only Us, a modern-day allegory for anyone dismantling the lies they were raised on. I'm Jackson Phoenix, and this book is for the ones who saw behind the curtain of certainty and chose to keep walking. It's raw, reflective, and unafraid to challenge the gods we made in our image. Only Us, available now on Amazon. Flip the script. Reclaim the story.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Hola y bienvenidos a ustedes. I can't go any farther than that. I was going to try and do my Radio Mundial voice, but I'm out of practice. Hey, this is Nat, by the way, and with my brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
I'm sorry. Say hola, John.
Hola, John.
All of this will make more sense in a moment when I introduce our guest, but this is the podcast that we have called This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you would have gotten the hell out of here by now. And John and I would be right there with you. Sadly, our third host, Bethany, who keeps us in line and lends us a tremendous amount of gravitas, is under the weather and not joining us today. So we send shout outs and healing vibes to Bethany. Hope you get better soon. We'll miss you. But in the meantime, we have an awesome guest. So let's just jump in and see how this goes. We have Steven HAuse, capital A. I told you I was going to say it, but I just messed it up. We'll talk about that maybe later, or maybe we'll just leave it as a total mystery and you'll just scratch your head. It's fine. But he's an English language teacher who has lived and taught in Bolivia, Spain, and Japan. He is the creator of the YouTube channel Love Unrelenting, which focuses on Christian universalism. His latest book by choir is Christ Saves All, Christian Universalist Perspectives. That's harder to say than you think. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Universalist. Anyway, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
Thanks. I'm doing well. Yeah, they say it's best to read out everything you write in a loud voice before you actually publish it to make sure that it's actually legible. But yeah, Christian Universalist Perspectives. There's a lot of T's in there, I guess. Yeah,
there's a lot. I think it's What do you call that in linguistics? Like a fricative of some. It's like I forget what that term for that sound you make.
I'm not.
It doesn't
sure,
matter. I took a class once upon a time, and all of a sudden I'm a linguist now. I took one linguistics class. No, that's not how that works. But anyway, you're in Spain, which I think is awesome. Must be late then. It's like 5:00 in Texas.
Yeah, it's 12:17 right now, so it's like midnight, and that's fine because I took a nap earlier in the day, as some people do in Spain. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're talking. This is interesting because we're talking to you tomorrow. You're already in tomorrow, and we're in today. We're time traveling, John.
That's great.
This has always been a dream of mine to time travel, and you've made it a reality. That's amazing. Well, hey, if you don't mind, we'll jump off with one of our sort of standard jumping off questions, if you're cool with that, and just start to ask you about your religious background, your journey. What led you to this heresy of universalism?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Bolivia. That's part of the reason that I can speak Spanish, and part of the reason I imagine that you introduced the opening with Spanish. Just so people understand.
Very poor Spanish. That was for all my Spanish-speaking friends. Lo siento mucho. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, and so my parents were evangelical missionaries, and obviously, when you grow up in the evangelical church, a lot of times, even if it's not the main focus of a sermon, there's that undertone or that, sort of behind the scenes idea of an eternal conscious torment in hell,
Yeah, for sure.
And that can be, something that is always on your mind, even if you're not always talking about it in the evangelical church. And so, I would get into reading more about that, and I would think, is this actually true? And over a long period of time, years and years, I eventually became convinced of universal salvation, that's actually the truth of the universe and the truth of God, and that there's no such thing as an eternal conscious torment or even annihilation for people who would, go to quote unquote hell. I think everybody eventually will be holy and happy. That's an old phrase that they used to use in the Universalist Church of the 1800s, which I think is a good summary, that everybody eventually will be holy and happy.
No, I like it. I mean, it was a similar path for me. Let me ask you this though. So, because I've always heard people peddle annihilationism as some sort of a happy medium of like, well, it's not torture. It's better than that. And I'm like, I guess, but it still sucks. I mean, is your take on that? Because I know there's, if you go from a strictly, I don't know, and I hate to use the term biblical, but if you scriptural, let's call it scriptural. If you go from a purely scriptural reading, you can find support for all three views. Is that your experience? Would you agree with that? I mean, I'm saying there's more support for one or the other, but you can certainly find a proof text here and there to probably back up whatever perspective you think. Has that been your experience?
I mean,
or are we...
I'll say that's definitely true in English, yeah, and Spanish too.
For sure.
I've read it in Spanish too. But I mean, to get into some boring things that universalists sometimes get into, there's translation issues and stuff. But in English and Spanish and in many other languages too, you can definitely read the Bible and say, okay, I can see how this would look like an annihilationist verse, or this one could look like an eternal torment kind of verse. And then, there's these other verses that seem like they say something about universal salvation, right? And so it is true that I actually believed in annihilation for a number of years. And it was verses that were not the ones that you typically think of as hell verses that actually convinced me of universal salvation. If you look at just the verses that, we would normally think of as applying to hell, I think annihilation would have a pretty strong case. But it's not exactly a happy ending for the universe either. It's just that I think some people end up accepting it because it's kind of better than eternal torment. So at least some people aren't being tortured forever,
Yeah.
It seems like this is like a trajectory, right? That a lot of people go through these phases of either believing in eternal conscious torment, and then they become kind of go to that middle ground of being what's the word I'm looking for? I've lost it.
Annihilationist.
Annihilationist. I was going to say nihilist.
That's a big word. Also sort of a nihilist. I think it's actually a bit nihilistic, but go ahead.
and then move from there to the other side, which is universal salvation. It seems to happen a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely happened to me, but it's also it happens just when you open yourself to saying that hell can be rethought. Then you already are, you're already moving in a direction away from just like locked into eternal conscious torment. So you're already opening yourself to one of the two perspectives, probably, and. So some people definitely do just stay in the annihilationist camp, and some people move over. But it's interesting. Every once in a while, I do read of people that go straight from eternal torment to universalism without thinking of annihilation as any kind of stepping stone. I obviously wasn't thinking of it as a stepping stone when I started to believe in it. When I was reading Clark Pinnock or what's the name of the guy? Who's John Stott. It's very popular in the Anglican Church in the UK many years ago. But yeah, so I wasn't thinking of it as a stepping stone, but eventually I started to feel this sort of knot in my stomach for a long time, months and months, thinking, I'm not sure I could even be happy in a universe where some people that were loved and loved other people would be lost forever, even if they're not tortured forever, but they're lost forever.
Yeah.
So that made me kind of read more and more, yeah.
For me, a lot of this started with just trying to wrap my head around logically the sense of torment. Like, I think you can reject hell on its face simply because it doesn't make any fucking sense. It's not consistent with anything we read about the nature of God, especially in the New Testament. It's certainly not consistent with how we see God revealed in Christ. And I realized I've just used profanity and talked about Jesus. Get over it. That's how I roll. I wasn't directed at you. That was too many audience members who were like, he just said fuck and then talked about Jesus.
Well, yeah, some people say Paul said shit. I don't know if that's
real. What I'm saying. I think Paul had a filthy mouth. But anyway, but the point of all that was that, like, I started out on my journey saying, well, I need to find. I felt the need to defend it scripturally, and I think that's important. I think it's at least a step. And then I got to a point where I'm like, I don't even need the Bible to just reject on its face the idea that a God who is all powerful, supposedly, will fail so miserably in his stated goal in Scripture of saving everyone. It's not his will that any should perish, right? Or that they should all come. So, and then somehow I think we invented an arbitrary dividing line, even though Paul says that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ and life, death, whatever, right? So we somehow got it in our heads that death was that final, like that was it. You had until the moment you die, however long that life would be, to make the correct decision, believe the right thing, say the right prayer, utter the right shibboleth, whatever you had to do. And then somehow convince God to love you back. It just didn't make any sense that this was the story we were telling, that Adam was 100% successful in condemning all of humanity forever. And Jesus is marginally successful. Actually, most would say an outright abject failure in his stated goal of saving everyone. And then I just got to a point where I don't have to understand how or the mechanism of how that all happens. I think it's enough to trust that God will accomplish that which he said he wants to accomplish. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and it's a tough question too with like understanding the Bible, because sometimes people will have questions. Well, depending on how you think of the Bible, so they'll say, but what if you were 100% sure that the Bible did say that some people were going to be tortured forever? Would you think that God was wrong in doing that? And it's sort of a strange question, because then you can ask somebody back, what if the Bible said that God created every person just to torture them? And that was would he be evil in doing that? And if they say no, then you say, but what would he be evil in doing that? I mean, like, can God be evil in any hypothetical situation in your mind? Or is it just that if God does something, it's good? So he can literally create a child, kill the child, revive the child, kill the child, torture the child. Is there anything that God can do in this theory that is evil? Or is it just anything God does is good because God does it, even if it's hypothetical, even if it has nothing to do with reality at all? And sort of a strange question where it's like, if the Bible said that, well, I don't think the Bible says that. But if it did, would you believe it? No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of freedom that comes in that for me anyway. I don't know about, I think for some people it might be scary because they've been raised like I was, that the Bible is authoritative and like capital A authoritative. Like that is the actual literal word of God, and thou shalt not trifle with it. And so we either go to these extremes of, well, then I have to reconcile everything and somehow make it work, which is just exhausting and untenable. Or we come to a place where I feel like I am now, where I'm going, if God said that, then I reject it. I don't actually think we're reading that correct. And there's things in the Old Testament that are very, very, very problematic. And I listen to a lot of atheist podcasts because I'm interested in that perspective, and get a lot of people who have conversations with these folks, and they'll say stuff like you just said. Well, look, this passage of scripture is God not only allowing, but prescribing and delineating how slavery works, where you can buy your slaves, how much you should pay for them, how you can treat them, how you can beat them as long as you don't kill them or they don't immediately die. It's fine if they die in a few days, but if they die immediately, and then the penalties are financial, or you have to pay a fine or something. And getting anybody in that sort of, the Bible is the word of God crowd to admit that that's terrible is hard. They're like, well, if I said that, would you say it was good? No, it's evil. Okay, but if God says it, then suddenly you're trying to find a way to reconcile that with, and you can't just, so I think it does force at some point a break. You have to go, okay, wait a minute, hold up. What do we do with scripture that is difficult, problematic, or sometimes even outright contradictory to what we have been taught is the nature of God? So let me ask you that question. What do we do with scripture in that case? Especially and I know we're talking about universalism, but the Bible in general, there are passages that are not unclear. And I rarely use the word, the phrase that the Bible clearly says something, but there are some things that are unambiguous. God says, go and kill every man, woman, child. And we get to go, yay, genocide. Or is there another way to look at that without completely sacrificing the nature of God? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this first, though, that there are some universalists who do believe in inerrancy, and I think that's actually kind of a consistent view that you can have, even though it's not the one that I believe in. Because you can say, oh, well, God did have these guidelines for slavery, but of course he's going to even restore these people who were slaves and suffered for a while and all that. But of course, the character of God is the big question on a lot of universalist minds. And that's why not many of them necessarily end up pulling to inerrancy for, an awfully long time. Because if you say, okay, God's going to save everybody, but he does do some genocide on Earth.
He dabbles a bit.
It sounds like the character of God. You haven't taken the character of God all the way to being pure love, which is, what we would think of when we just look at Jesus. And so, of course, my answer is not going to be a very original one, but it's going to be the one, the kinds that somebody like Brad Jersak or Brian Zahn would give, which is that Jesus is the key, the interpretive key, even to the Old Testament. And so if there's something that in the Old Testament that it says that God commands, or at least implies that God commands, or even says that God does, or implies that God does, but it doesn't seem like Jesus would do it, then you probably either have to reread it or reject it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, John and I know Brad pretty well, and he's one of those guys. I haven't talked to him in a little while, so I don't know where he stands these days, but he's one of those guys. He would call himself a hopeful universalist. Like he's not gonna go fully to the camp of universalism, because for him that's a bridge too far, and it takes away human choice. Like at some point we have to. There's a part for us to play. I was with him. I am with him on a lot of things. I would break with him there and be like, well, why not just take the next logical step?
Yeah.
You know, and just say, okay, well, and certainly he would reject any notion of eternal conscious torment. So I think in the Orthodox Church, the view of hell is much more of a restorative rather than a punitive thing. So somehow or other, we're all going to go. We may go through that, whatever that purgative fire of whatever that looks like.
Refining fire.
Yeah, refining fire. I mean, I don't know. I don't love that, but again, speaking in degrees of badness, it's like, okay, well, there are certain people who will die with, with so much hate in their hearts that there's going to have to be something to bring them around, I would think. I mean, the obvious name to throw out would be like a Hitler type guy, and that's the guy that you go, well, if God could restore anyone, well, it's certainly not Hitler. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Either God's all powerful or he's not. Maybe hell for Hitler will be having to come face to face with the millions of people he killed and beg for their forgiveness. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that would be part of it for sure. Yeah, it would be coming face to face with the people that he killed. But another interesting thing is how many people that you speak to who do think that Hitler is suffering in eternal conscious torment think that none of the people he killed are suffering in eternal conscious torment.
Right.
Many of them actually think that he's burning beside the Jews he killed.
Right.
So that's much crazier than thinking that Hitler will be restored eventually. Now, if somebody said, and I can imagine some Jewish people saying this, and I have talked to Jewish people actually, that would say the reason Hitler should be tortured forever is because he killed the Jews. And they obviously do not think that Jews are suffering beside him. So I'm thinking of Christian people in this case.
For sure.
But there may be some Jews who think that none of the Jews who died are obviously suffering eternal conscious torment and that only Hitler is. That one would make a little more sense. But for the people who are Christian people who actually think that most of the Jews who died in the Holocaust are suffering forever and Hitler is also there, it seems like a strange move, at least rhetorically, to say, but Hitler's so evil that he shouldn't be saved. And you're like, okay, but what about all the people that you're claiming suffered and they are the evidence of his evil?
Yeah.
It's a very question.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to think about, that, especially, I forget how somebody phrased it, but essentially, having exited this world in the fires of Hitler's ovens, only to awaken in the fires of some hell. That it's strange credulity. There's, like I said, there's enough logical inconsistency to say, I just don't I don't see the point of it. And I don't see throughout Scripture, and there are isolated incidences, of course, but I don't see God as at least largely being a God who is just retributive for the sake of punishment. Like usually God's, whatever you might discern as punishment, has a restorative sense to it. There's let's learn. What do you learn from eternal torture? There's no escape from that. That's just sadistic. That's just sadism for the point of sadism. So whatever it is, and we're all obviously speculating. None of us know. We ain't been there. But I have to imagine that whatever God has planned for us post-mortem would not be like radically different than what he had planned for us in life. I mean, that we would continue on whatever trajectory we were on. C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, did a lot for me on this. And way early on in my deconstruction, I read that and it stuck with me for a long time because I'm not sure if you've read it, but it's a novel. And in it, there's a guy who's waiting at a bus station for a bus to take him someplace. And he's in this sort of gray place. And the story is that he's traveling whatever this road is to get to paradise. And along the way, he meets people who for whatever reason, either can't or won't make the trip with him for whatever reason. And so his guide on it is George MacDonald. So, which, who C.S. Lewis is always credited as being his greatest teacher and mentor. And like I think he said he never wrote a book where George MacDonald wasn't at least somehow mentioned or had inspired it. But it was an interesting concept of, okay, well, just because you took your last breath in this life doesn't mean that it's all over and that God's that God's pursuit somehow stops. But there were still things carried over into that middle space that kept people from being able to move forward. There was either unforgiveness, or there was vanity, or there was something that kept people stuck even in that place. And I think Brad Jursak would say something like, at the end of it all, it's like it might be infinitesimally small amount of people who will ultimately reject Christ, but the vast majority of people, no matter how long it takes, will eventually be brought in. So I just don't know why you don't go up. Eventually, then God can reach everyone.
Yeah, God is more patient than we are rebellious, because God is simply better than us in every way. So, we can be rebellious, but if his patience is, stronger than our rebellion, then he'll reach each of us in the end. And of course, I can recommend a bunch of books, but I don't like just listing lots of books. But there's a book by Thomas Talbot called The Inescapable Love of God, which he even talks about the rationality that's necessary for you to actually reach the minimal threshold of freedom, like an actual kind of freedom. And so if you're literally sitting in a room being tortured forever, let's say, or let's just say the C.S. Lewis gray world, if you're sitting in the gray world for, let's say, millions of years, it would seem that, and you had the option to leave, then it would seem that maybe your freedom has been so affected by a certain lack of rationality that it can't actually be categorized as a true freedom. If you're literally just suffering, even though you have the option not to suffer, and you have the option to live life the way that it should be lived, filled with love and purpose and meaning and community and all that, then it seems that if that were to go on long enough, that couldn't be categorized as a real and genuine freedom. And so that's an interesting argument from Talbot. There's also, speaking of some of the things in the Old Testament, there's a great book by Robin Perry called The Evangelical Universalist, where he even talks about how even in the Old Testament, God is using punishment for restoration purposes, more for the nation of Israel, not so much for individuals and things like that, but it still shows this pattern of restoration.
Yeah. Now, Robin Perry's great, by the way. I was going to ask about Robin, but David Bentley Hart was also another big influence, because I like to read books with big, huge words. And
his book was the one that literally did convince me and finally tipped me over and made me so happy that I was like, hey, this isn't just that it's not only an option to believe, because I was kind of like, maybe this is an okay option for Christians to believe, But then I was like, wait a second, it's not actually just an option. This is literally the best option.
Yeah.
And so it's great. And so, I was so happy that I was able to put him in a documentary that I made called Love Unrelenting, which is the name of my YouTube channel. And then I eventually made a biographical documentary about him, which was a lot of fun to make.
Yeah.
He's great to talk to.
He's an interesting cat. We've been trying like hell to get him on the show, but I don't know. So far, he has resisted, or we haven't gotten in touch with the right people. But the other guy that really influenced me a lot, especially really early on, was Rob Bell. And just because and now I go back and read Love Wins and go, that's a fairly tame book. I mean, he doesn't really actually take any hard stance. It really is just a book of really good questions. But it did, I think, what he intended for it to do, which was get a guy like me to go, okay, maybe I've been thinking about this wrong. Maybe I've just, and up to that point, to be fair, I've never been utterly convinced of the reality of eternal conscious torment. It always struck me as weird. I really never taught my kids that. It wasn't anything I really had to unteach from them. But it was just something that we just didn't talk about. Even though in the back of my mind, I knew this is the reality according to what my churches that I attended had taught me. And then there was this weird, like, visceral sense of relief after reading that book, that I was like, oh, it's the same way I felt after I read, I want to say the guy's name because he turned into a bit of a turd, but there's a guy that wrote a book called Raptureless. And it was the same way I felt after reading that book, going, oh, you mean the rapture's bullshit? And a weight I didn't even know that I'd been carrying was like gone. I'm like, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore. That's all horse shit. And the same thing came with, once I sort of just in my brain anyway, I think my heart had been there for a long time, but once my brain could reconcile as well, this like, that's not what God's going to do, because that's not what God is. And that would not be reflective of his love and care for the world and the things he created. Man, it was the same sort of thing. I'm like, oh, I'm walking a little bit lighter, because now I can focus on all these things that actually do matter. without this nagging thing in the back of my head that says, well, maybe God's going to throw all my loved ones into a fiery pit and burn them. There's a lot of freedom. Go for it, man.
I was just going to say, it's sort of an interesting that you mentioned, an interesting idea that you mentioned, the disconnect between the heart and the brain, kind of, because that's sort of like George MacDonald, who you mentioned earlier. He said, if some people, I mean, this is obviously, he says it much better, but if some people believe that it would be a better world if God were to do this, then that means that you believe God to be better than he is, which means that that is what God actually is.
Yeah.
Because you can't imagine God to be better than he is, because God is always better than you can imagine him to be. So if you imagine him to be better, then he's better than that. So he's not going to be worse than you imagine him to be. He's not going to be, I mean, if Jesus shows us God, and George MacDonald is obviously all into that, then then God is better than anything you can imagine. So don't think that you have to accept that some people are going to be tortured forever. And you have to be like, well, I wish that God was as loving as I am. You know, it's not like that. It's the opposite. It's the opposite.
Well, I mean, that's one of the arguments we make, right? Is especially if you're a parent, that if we look at God as a parent, and then would we send our children to this place of eternal conscious torment? I would never send my child to this kind of place. I would never send my child to a place of torture. And then you have to ask the question: then, am I a better parent than God would be?
Yeah.
Yeah. And even the more Arminian response would be, well, you might not send your child there, but would you let your child go to a place of everlasting torment? Wouldn't you let him fall and jump into the pit? And then a lot of parents would say, well, no, I wouldn't let him jump into a pit of eternal torment either. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, so you're saying you would interfere with his free will?
Yeah, exactly.
And my response would be, absolutely, I would.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is why I think the free will question is ridiculous. First of all, I don't think it's real. I don't think any such thing as like libertarian free will it can't possibly be real. We're just too messed up. We have too much baggage for any of us to ever have made any kind of rational free choice about much of anything. I think if at best we can make choices based on limited information, sure, there's will involved in that.
Yeah.
But I don't know everything. So how could I possibly make the best decision in every circumstance? But the idea somehow that, and I've used this argument back when I used to argue, because to be frank, I don't argue anymore. It's just, it's exhausting. People who want to know will come and ask, and we can have really good, genuine. My experience has been most people who ask questions about this stuff, a good chunk of them, they're not genuinely asking questions. They usually ask gotcha questions, and they're just trying to get you to say something. I feel like Jesus being quizzed down by the Pharisees, but not that I'm saying I'm like Jesus, although. But anyway, the point is that so much of this hinges, and so much of the knee-jerk Christian response to this stuff is that, well, God's not going to force you to do anything. God wouldn't interfere with your free will, so therefore, He doesn't send you to hell. You send yourself to hell. You never wanted anything to do with God, and now you get your wish at the end of it all. To which I say, I spanked my kid once, and I cried for 4 hours. I can't imagine inflicting harm on any of my kids beyond that. And I would never even do that again. It breaks my heart to even think about. And I certainly wouldn't. I would rescue them from an abusive situation. I would pull them out in front of a moving car. I would jump into a pool to rescue them if they were drowning, all of which I'm interfering with whatever the free will. Hey, he chose to walk out in the street. I guess he'd get. What a silly argument. God doesn't wait to be asked to rescue. He's a lifeguard at a swimming pool. He's going to jump in and grab you. So for me, that's a non sequitur, that whole idea. But how do we rationalize or reconcile that idea of will with, or are we pushing against ultimately God's will with our own, and will eventually sort of be brought in line? I don't know. Those are questions that I kind of
the part of my comfort with the whole free will debate is that I've read atheists too, and atheists don't agree on how to think of free will too. So I'm just like, okay, so Sam Harris believes in absolutely no free will. He's a full determinist. He doesn't believe in compatibilism at all. But then you can read other guy, Michael Shermer, for example, calls himself a compatibilist, even though he sounds like a libertarian basically when I read him. But then so I'm like, okay, so at least even if we have trouble with free will, everybody has trouble with free will. So it's not a strictly universalist thing. It's not a strictly Christian thing. It's not any. Everybody has trouble with free will. And the interesting thing too about universalism is you can be almost anywhere across the spectrum on free will within the normal, let's say Christian perspectives, like open theism, where God literally doesn't know a lot of things that would happen in the future, all the way to hard determinism, like a hardcore Calvinist view that God is kind of like a puppet master. You can be a universalist anywhere along that spectrum. And there are arguments for it. I don't like the determinist view where God controls everything, because then it makes it seem like any time that somebody inflicts harm on somebody else, it's kind of like God is inflicting harm on somebody. But you can still believe those things and end up coming out to a fairly consistent universalist perspective. So that's the interesting thing. But when people do make that idea, that kind of criticism of universalism that you mentioned, where they go, well, it's your own free will that's going to resist God forever. Most Christians would at least want to think twice about that, because in the minds of most Christians, God at least exhaustively knows the future. So this would exclude open theists, which think that God doesn't exhaustively know the future. But if you think that God says, I'm going to make this world, I know beforehand that some people are going to choose to suffer forever, and then they will suffer forever, but I'm still going to make this world. You would have to ask yourself, why would he choose to make that world and not another world? Or why did he choose to make that world and no world? Because it's a world where some people, even if it's self-inflicted torture, let's say, I'm trying to make it the strongest version.
Sure.
Because the weakest version is obviously just God tortures people forever and ever, and he's the one stabbing them, right? But the stronger version is, let's say, they torture themselves. They choose the suffering for themselves. But even if, like, let's say that you're going to have a kid, you're going to have 4 kids, and you know that one of your 4 kids is going to torture himself forever. You would definitely think twice before doing it. And I'm guessing that a lot of parents would just say, you know what? If those are the 2 options, have 4 kids and one who tortures himself forever, or have no kids, I'm probably going to go with no kids.
Yeah. Or at least stop at 3.
Well, let's say it's the middle child. I don't know.
No, we're the roll of the dice. No, but you're 100% right. And that is a very difficult question. I used to scoff at questions like that when I was a pretty diehard evangelical, because, well, quite frankly, I didn't have a good answer for it. So if I don't have a good answer, I should scoff. But the problem of evil, the problem of God, especially, and I think I fall in the open theist camp more so than others, because for me, it does the best job of salvaging the nature of God, because there's too many questions of arbitrary sort of selective choice with God if he's controlling everything. So if God controls everything, then he's got a lot to answer for. If God is not controlling everything, then yeah, I have to reimagine then what I have been taught and what I think about God. I think Thomas J. Oord does a really, really good job with a lot of this material, with this idea that God does not exhaustively know the future, that God does not unilaterally act to intervene in the world and to save some and not save others, and heal some and harm others. He would reject that. And so I don't know. It does make things. I think the reason we lean towards some of these other definitions and perspectives on God is because it makes those things, even though they're problematic, it does make them clean. Like, okay, well, I know how this goes. Boom, 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 boom. It all sucks, but I understand it. This other view and some of these other views does make a real big, messy middle part of that, where you have to say stuff like, well, I don't know. I don't know how God accomplished, and maybe you have a better answer than this for me than I do, but my answer is, I don't know how God accomplishes that goal. I actually can't conceive of how some people who I think of who are absolutely beyond, I would think beyond redemption, could be redeemed. But I fall back on, but I trust the one who made them to know how to get through to them. It's not my job to know how that gets done, but maybe you have a better answer of how that, if there's a mechanism at play, or if it's just like me, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Oord, I love talking to Thomas J. Oord, and I was able to go out to Idaho one time and interview him out in the woods there. And he isn't able to be a confident universalist because of how far on the open theist spectrum. He's so far on the open theist spectrum that he's almost between open theism and process theism.
Yeah, exactly.
But I
think he's actually writing a systematic theology right now. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but I love talking to him, and I love that he has a very love-focused understanding of God. Because anybody that has an understanding of God's priorities as being that God is love, then I'll almost always I admire a lot of things that they say, even if I don't agree with, the conclusions of all the theology always. But the free will whole thing is kind of a really tough question. But I think the three famous parables of Jesus, that universalists like to hold to anyway, or to talk about anyway, are, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, right? And so Ord would agree with this, obviously, that God has the character that he never gives up. But I would just be more confident in saying that God has that character where he'll wait for the son until he returns. He'll look for the coin until he finds it, and he'll look for the 100 sheep until he's able to get it back with the herd, right? And that everlasting patience will eventually win over everybody. And I'm more confident in it than he would be, just because he has such a high view of libertarian freedom. And I believe in a kind of libertarian freedom, but it wouldn't be in that same way as Ord does, where it's it's almost I don't want to say like chaos, but it's almost like you have such a high level of freedom that there are many choices that I think would be unlikely in my view. Yeah. But anyway, in the end, I do think that God, with the everlasting patience and the everlasting love and his I'll actually look for a quote while you're talking. There's a great quote from Talbot about how God knows us better than we know ourselves and knows the ways to reach us better than we even can understand ourselves. And so I think that God's knowledge and not only his foreknowledge, but just his knowledge of the people that he himself made plays into how he'll be able to reconcile everybody to himself, even if they're people that have lived 80 horrible, selfish years here on earth. There's, eternity on the other side, and eternity of God's love to reach them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, free will for me is a weird one. I mean, I don't believe that we have all the resources to understand what free will would be. I don't think we have free will because we don't know everything. And so I wrote in my book, like this, only analogy I could come up with is you're driving down a road and the road is washed out, but you don't know that. But your free will makes you go straight through where the road is washed out. If you knew the road was washed out, you'd make a turn. You'd do a U-turn. You'd make a change, but you don't know that information. And that's how I kind of look at free will. It's like we don't have all the information, so free will doesn't really. I don't think it exists.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that it wouldn't exist in the absolute sense of for us to be able to make fully, completely informed decisions, we would have to have all the information of the universe, which we don't have. But I think that we have to have some kind of free will where we're able to choose between A and B in a number of circumstances, or else we end up with randomness or the puppet master God of Calvinism, sort of. And that's always my concern. And so, there's what David Bentley Hart talks about as sort of this classical view of freedom with rational, where your rational nature is going toward a certain end, but you make confused choices along the way, but you actually will eventually end up, after making a bunch of confused choices, at the place you're supposed to be. Something like that seems good, but something like that seems to involve some kind of libertarian free will in there. But I also don't want to bore people too much by talking about libertarian free will. I don't know. I like talking about free will, and I've read a lot of books on free will.
I don't know how much, if at all, you've ever delved into Girard, but
a little bit. Yeah.
So he unlocked some stuff for me. So I would say, from a Girardian perspective, and I'm no Girard. I mean, I've read Girard, but I'm not a scholar, and I don't think he's the end all be all. There are definitely limitations to mimetic theory, and however, I think from a Girardian perspective, you would look at free will and say pure libertarian free will is off the table, simply because of all of the influences that we all have that are either conscious or unconscious, or all the things that have happened to us that are outside of our choices. I can't control where I was born, the family I was born to, the culture I was born into, the language I speak, the level of education I might have been given early on. There's all these things that inform my choices that are so outside of my control. They're not deterministic, in a sense that, there's some God up there who's directing my paths and I'm going to go where but there is some level of determinism based on, listen, I could look at you and say, I think I know which way you're going to go here, based on your background, based on your culture, based on your lack of education or way too much education, whatever. You might, you'd probably go left or right here. And I think there's a lot of that. So I think the free will, whatever will there is, I like Brad Jersak's take on this, where he says, I don't believe in free will, I believe in freed will. So for him, the idea of a rational person dying and going to hell based on choices they've made, which were not fully informed, which could not have been fully informed. And from my atheist friends would say, it's not my fault you never convinced me that God exists. I can't convince myself. I can't suddenly just believe. And so I should be punished forever because the God of the universe didn't do a better job of convincing me, of showing up and actually demonstrating this for me. I should have, but there's a lot to that for me. I can wrap my head around that and it helps me be compassionate to people who make choices I don't understand. And I go, oh God. And then if you peel back the layers, I think any good storytelling does this, right? We start off with characters who were like wholly irredeemable pieces of crap. And then as the story gets told, you go, oh, okay. Eventually you might get to a place of understanding, okay, the choices were bad, but I see how you got there. Like you might not have had any better choices than the ones you made along the way. And I think that's analogous to how we are with God. And I mean, there are people who reject God for very good reasons. Any of their, maybe every one of their interactions with somebody who represented God has been horrifying. And their best choice is to say, nope, not going there. But I also then trust if I believe in God and ask me on any given day and I'll give you a different answer. But if I do believe in a God, that's the God I believe in, the one that loves relentlessly, the one that is endlessly patient. The scriptures say so all the time, that his mercies never end. What always kills me is that you go to church and we would sing these songs with those words, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. Right. And I'm like, unless you die in your sin, then you're going to hell. Oh, wait a minute. That's not the verse. And we would sing so much of, I was a worship leader for lots of years. I would say 80%, and that's a made up statistic. Don't hold me to it. But a whole lot of Christian songs are so universalist in theme. Your love never, the one you just sang, right? It never gives up. It never runs out on me. There's all kinds of songs we sang in church that had messages you could sing that you could almost never preach from the pulpit. It's like, hey, you just sang these really great songs about how God's going to be patient forever and he loves everyone all the time. And let me now preach a message about how he's going to send about 2/3 of you to hell. There's got to be some way of reconciling. I don't know. I don't have a question there. I guess I was just ranting. I apologize for that. But
it's also, the evangelical church I grew up going to, I just visited it not too long ago in South America, in Bolivia. And it's interesting how I was talking to the pastor there who knows me pretty well, and he knows that I have views that he doesn't agree with. And I said, it's interesting how your sermons, they almost never actually contradict universalism. I think it's because you don't want to say anything explicitly about and if you don't accept this, you'll be tortured forever. I've never heard that phrase. I've heard, and without Jesus, there's darkness. Okay, well, universalists
separation
can say that.
From God, right?
Yeah, universalists can say, without Jesus, there's darkness. They just think that everybody will come to Jesus. Or universalists can say, Christ saves. That's totally fine. But they would just say Christ saves all eventually, right? Or even Christ saves all now, depending on how you look at it. But there's a lot of different perspectives within universalism. That's part of the complication. But
Absolutely.
Anyway, but it's just sort of interesting how a lot of evangelical churches, even though in their official doctrinal statement, maybe it will say something about eternal torment, but even it seems like they're embarrassed by it sometimes. Some aren't. Some aren't.
No, you're right. There's a very vocal minority who are super proud and a little bit gleeful about the fact that some of y'all are going to get yours. That sickens me. I remember asking, I used to sort of live, because I was teetering between the evangelical world. I was on staff at a church and I was, had aspirations of full-time vocational ministry and all this stuff. And I was teetering on the edge of universalism. And I always was very nervous about getting called out, and I've been called into my pastor's office on more than one occasion to discuss, my heretical views. And then I just decided I didn't care anymore. But I don't know, the whole notion that, and I will say this, that ours was a very very typical, I think, evangelical church where we didn't talk about that stuff. Mm-hmm. It didn't come up in sermons. You could come to any one of those sermons. It'd be like going to a really good 12-step message, lots of good pragmatic things, stuff to help you with your life. And we didn't talk bad about gay folks, but I guarantee we thought bad about gay folks. There was all kinds of things that, let me ask you that. Maybe that's a good segue. Universalism, does that leave more room for LGBTQ folks, or is there still that same sort of like resistance to that segment of our population, at least in your experience.
Let me mention something real quick that I think is kind of interesting, how you were kind of nervous about it and embarrassed by it. For some reason, when I came to believe in universalism, I just was not embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
I thought I was embarrassed by the path. I was like, I used to believe that God allowed people to be suffering forever. I was embarrassed by that. I had believed that, but I was like, this isn't embarrassing at all. So that's why I ended up making a channel.
I agree with you. Yeah.
But as far as the LGBTQ stuff, in my case, I did come to believe that wasn't a sinful thing, but universalists are across the spectrum on it, in that really the only thing that unites universalists is their universalism, really. So there are some universalists I know who are young earth creationists. They believe in a 6-day creation, 24-hour day creation. They believe in, spanking kids, for example, like you mentioned earlier. They believe in some heavy violence in the Old Testament, but they also believe that God will eventually reconcile all people to himself and nobody will be tortured forever. But then there are also people like Eric Reitan, who was a co-author of a book called, God's Final Victory. And he also wrote another book on why he supported gay marriage. So that was like his second. So he wrote God's Final Victory and then the gay marriage book. And so, and he used kind of the same logic in it of the God of love and a God who makes accommodations for all kinds of people and things. And I think a part of what differentiates the two is that one is just like this eschatology issue, and one is sort of like what we would categorize as sin or not a sin. So universalists are trying to divide, because there's like some Eastern Orthodox universalists who are probably much more conservative on that kind of thing, or some hopeful universalists who are Catholic who probably would be more conservative on those kind of things. But if you talk to mainline Protestant universalists, they would be more likely like marriage equality kind of stuff. I'm guessing.
I'd just be curious, because if God saves all, when they go to heaven, are they still gay? Or are they going to go like, God in his infinite love will bring them around to heteronormativity, and they'll all be...
Some would probably say that. Some would say no. And I'm guessing that some universalists would probably say that whole, any kind of sexual orientation would be gone in heaven anyway. So it would probably depend on which universalist you ask. Because in the early church, or not the early church maybe, but like John Calvin and those guys, they thought that everybody's soul was feminine. So, everybody
is the Isle of Lesbos. Great.
Basically,
we're all just bone. Like I don't know, man. I can't imagine heaven would be very heavenly if we weren't allowed to. Anyway, so I'll get off that message. John,
or do you want to talk about sex in heaven? Some people have
John and I and Bethany, all three of us, were very vocally supportive of our LGBTQ friends and family and ally, and so it comes up even when it doesn't maybe organically come up, just because we want to make sure that we're at least one of a handful of voices who are still saying, like, these people are humans and they deserve rights and dignity and respect. And
I think definitely universalists, I mean, it depends on, I won't say that it is a school of thought that is inherently pro-LGBTQ, but I wouldn't say it's obviously, I don't think that it has anything inherently against it either. It's sort of like, I'm trying to think of just, I don't know, evolution, I guess. Probably most people that are LGBTQ would believe in evolution if they're still, if they're interested in theology and things, some kind of theistic evolution. But I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if out there's some kind of maybe an interesting combination of a very, very vocal gay rights advocate who's also a 6-day creationist. I mean, it would be interesting, but I'm sure that those kinds of things exist. I mean, my good friend has an aunt who's very, very vocal lesbian, very, very pro-Trump. I don't know. There's interesting combinations out there. I don't think that universalism has anything inherently against that. I think it's sort of separate, and you'll see universalists that are across the spectrum on that question.
Yeah. So for me, one of the things that also changed my opinion on universal salvation or universalism or whatever you want to call it is my thought on people outside of what we quote unquote call the Christian faith. Right. So for me, I've moved past this idea of a Christ-centered salvation and to a more universal salvation, that all are saved regardless if they are Christian or not. Have you come across that type of universalist?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that would and most people would call that a pluralist kind of universalist, like John Hick would be an example of that. And there's other people too. Actually, in this book that I put together, I didn't write it, but it's a compilation of 8 different essays. One of them is sort of somebody trying to deal with that question of if there is a great validity in other religions, and he thinks that there is validity in other religions, would we want to come to that kind of conclusion where everybody will be saved together, or would we want to come to a conclusion where people will actually come to the end that is expected in their religion? Because nirvana, at least in his mind, this is Professor Mark Heim at Yale, in his understanding of these different religious paths, there's a different conclusion at the end. Nirvana is not the same as heaven. And so he actually says, he's a Christian, and he thinks that some of these ultimate destinations are actually walled off from each other. So it could be kind of thought of as a universalism in that people reach multiple good ends. But could we say that everybody is holy and happy together? Because he doesn't want to kind of flatten the other religions in a way that some people would say that John Hick does, where he says, well, everybody, the real, I think he capitalizes the real and things like that a lot to kind of just generalize it over the base. I would call myself an inclusivist, so I wouldn't be a pluralist, and that I wouldn't think that all religions have the equal understanding of things and equal value necessarily, but I also wouldn't be an exclusivist in that I don't think that if you're Muslim, automatically you go to hell or something like that. I think I would be an inclusivist, sort of along the lines of C.S. Lewis, where there's, God understands, kind of like we were talking about with free will earlier. God understands that people have all these different factors in their lives. And it's not as if, a lady who has lived in a village until she's 80 years old, it's not like her theology is going to be, the same as somebody who's been living in a completely different country, reading completely different books, having a completely different life, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's part of where I started from this, because I mean, even at a young age, I'd ask that question, right? So there's this person in some deepest, darkest place in Africa, never hears the word Jesus in his or her life. So this person goes to hell because God wasn't big enough to reach them with the word of Christ. I think that was the beginning of my questioning of how people are saved, right?
Yeah, and I think that's more of a question that people would call inclusivism, and then there's universalism, and a lot of times the two can go together just fine. And I think that universalists would have some answer to that, and that they'd say, well, God would still be active in the person's life even after they die here on earth, and inclusivists would come in. Many times it's the same person, and say, and actually he was already active in that person's life on earth, and he, whatever their understanding of him was, they may have had a better relationship with him from the limited knowledge that they had compared to, let's say some American pastor who had studied for 10 years at, Union Seminary or something.
Probably. I mean, but it's funny because that's like sort of the apologist's answer to these questions is always, if you put it to them bluntly, like, well, what do we do in that situation that John described, where you have somebody in a very remote place who's been isolated and they die? Do they go to hell? And they'll almost say, oh, no, that's, and I said, well, then stop evangelizing them.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like what are you doing going to remote areas and putting them in jeopardy of going to hell when they were perfectly fine otherwise? Why don't you just leave them the hell alone and let them do what they do? And actually, I don't know. That was my question also for Calvinists. I always wonder why they bother to evangelize. Like, if you're really a hardcore determinist, what are you doing? Like, just let God sort it out. That's what's going to happen anyway. He's pre-selected some for salvation and some for damnation. And who are we to fool with that? I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just more of a...
Yeah, I could get into the better. Obviously, I agree with you, but I mean, the nicer presentation of those ones from a lot of times what a more Arminian missionary would say, well, they're given the choice right at death, maybe they'll say. And the people that they would have chosen Jesus, they're the ones that if we were to send missionaries to them, they would choose when we get there. So it's not that there actually is a change being made there. And then the Calvinists would say, yes, but we're being used by God to spread the message, to actually manifest who
Right,
the elect
right.
people are and all those things.
Definitely.
But yeah, obviously, I don't agree with
No,
those
maybe
two
you're
things
part of
anyway.
that plan. I get it. That you can argue that, well, it was part of God's plan to send me there to do this. And I would say, from my experience with a lot of missionary work, and I'm not casting aspersions on the whole lot, but if we're betting on those guys to save a bunch of folks, man, I'm not sure that's a good bet. John and I both participated in what I would call like tourism missionary work in our teens. I actually had really good friends who were missionaries in Bolivia as well for many years with, was it SAM? I think that was the group they were with. South American Mission.
South American Mission, yeah, that's my father's mission. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's in that one, yeah.
I don't know what the work they did there. I know they were and are genuinely good people. And a lot of the work they did there was not necessarily proselytizing an event. It was mostly service work. You know, it was flying medical
SAM is
supplies
also, interestingly, mostly Calvinist mission. It's a reformed one historically, yeah. And Sam Air is probably what you're thinking of.
Sam Air, my buddy Tom was a pilot and an aircraft mechanic after he left the Coast Guard, but he went to Moody Bible Institute, and then he ended up becoming a pilot and a mechanic for Sam Air, and they spent 10 or 12 years in Bolivia. But here's a guy who like literally put his life at risk in small airplanes that they kept held together with duct tape and baling wire, flying food and medical supplies and stuff into remote areas of Bolivia. And you've lived there, you know how treacherous that can be. And then they left, and I forget when it was. It's been about 10 years now. But when Bolivia became very unstable, they finally got pulled out. They're like, okay, they'd had a coup.
I may know him. I'll ask you his last name once we're done. I may know this guy. Yeah,
I'll tell you, it's Throssell.
Tom Throssell. Okay, yeah, I know Philip Throssell and his son.
Philip is his son, and Janine, his wife. So I went to school with Janine. She was my wife's best friend in high school, and so their whole family. And then she married Tom, and so good dude, right?
So my brother and the class that he was in, I think Philip was in that. No. What's the older kid's name? Anyway, it doesn't matter. We don't have to. People listening will not care about this.
Patrick. No, Patrick's their nephew. Anyway, go ahead. But
my brother was in his class. Yeah. But anyway, I knew the Throsses, yeah, for sure.
Well, that's cool, man. What a small world. It's they're back in California now. So
but Philip's getting married. Yeah.
Well, I say all of that to say that, while I don't necessarily agree with sort of this mass evangelism, this sort of mass missionary, especially I think it's been very colonial in its approach. I know people who do this work, and I know the ones that I know, man, they're genuinely good people. They genuinely have good hearts, and they just want to help people. And they just want to do stuff that's meaningful. And so I think it's up to the church to redirect some of that energy. And I have seen, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it seems like in the last 10 or 15 years anyway, church structures have gotten away from that, or getting away from that model of missionary work and trying, especially in places like Africa, trying to train up local people. Like, so send a small team in, raise up some pastors, help them establish some churches, then let them run with it, because it doesn't have to look like your church in Texas. It needs to look like your church in Burkina Faso or wherever you're doing the work. I mean, it needs to take on the flavor. Paul would say that. I mean, Paul didn't go and try to impose his culture on every place he established a church. I think that's a positive. But for me, then the whole notion of universalism or universal salvation, let's just call it what it is, universalism. It's the only thing keeping me holding on, if I'm being fair. Because if I was forced, you put a gun to my head and I had to go, agree that God would not eventually save everyone, then I don't think he's a God worth paying any attention to. That's just, to put it very bluntly. Any God who would allow or would cause eternal suffering on anybody is a monster and should be rejected outright.
And when I was talking to somebody who was very concerned about my spiritual life because of universalism, and she said, well, what if it ended up to be true? What if it ended up that, some people do get tortured forever? Don't you think you could be happy? And I said, if that was the case, I would ask God to annihilate me, because I would be sad every day. I mean, I would literally be in heaven knowing that some people are being tortured forever. And it's sort of in that view of eternal torment, it sort of just makes two hells. There's nice hell and bad hell, but they're both hells. Because there's nice hell where you are comfortable, but you're being tortured internally. If you really do have the love of Christ, which is the love of your neighbor, which is that you love your neighbor as yourself, you'll be tortured internally knowing that other people are being tortured. I'm not saying it's nearly as bad as the torture that they're having, but it would be like a hell number 1 and a hell number 2. So it'd be a big problem.
Think about that. Have you watched Severance?
I watched the first 3 episodes. I haven't.
Okay, finish watching Severance. I'm going to mess it for you a little bit. This is Severance. This is what you just described is the premise, where we now have a divided personality, the one who is able to stay home blissfully unaware of what's going on at work. Meanwhile, the person going to work can never leave and eventually comes to resent and hate the person who sent him there, which is him. And so the promise of, hey, you could have this completely separate work life and home life starts out good and eventually becomes torture for both people. The person living on the outside, they call the outie, is tortured by what's happening to the person who's left, and the person inside is literally tortured by monotony and the sameness and the inescapability of what has been created for them. How neither one can be happy. And I imagine that a heaven hell scenario like we've been taught is that very, even though we've been told we'll be in heaven and that every tear will be wiped away and right, we're going to be blissfully unaware of what's going on. I don't know that we will. David Archuleta, who was I forget where he finished in American Idol. I don't know if you know his name.
I've heard the name, but I'm not sure.
Up until a couple of years ago, very devout Mormon, and then he came out, and he wrote a song based on something his mother told me, which has sort of become my mantra. So she wrote him a letter when he came out, and he was leaving the church, and essentially said, "Well, the church says you're going to hell, but if you're going to hell, I'm coming with you." That's it. If it came down to it, what's that?
And that's the love of Jesus, I think. Yeah, in the end.
I think so. I think any self-respecting person would be like, well, if that's the way it has to be, well, I'm not going there while you go there. I guess we're both going to hell or annihilate me, something. But I can't live happily there. Go ahead, John. I stepped on your
I was just saying. Well, and the other issue for me in that scenario is we've been taught that you cannot be separated from God. Period.
Right.
There is no separation from. So that means God's in control of hell. God's in charge.
Well, somebody had to create it.
So again, we have this monster who is on one side playing the game of, I'm going to make these people happy and give them paradise, but I'm also in charge and running this place. Then of course they're like, no, it's Satan, but you can't be separated from God. So God is there, and God is that. It's a really weird mindfuck for me.
Well, you remember what Jeff Turner said, right? So, my friend, if you haven't ever met Jeff Turner, meet Jeff Turner. You'll love him. And he wrote a book a few years ago called The Atheistic Theist, and it's really good. But in a conversation with him once, he said, well, the traditional view of heaven and hell is eternal conscious torment, forces you to be a polytheist, because this place that supposedly is completely absent from God, well, something has to maintain that place. Something has to run it. So there's got to be a godlike entity that created, maintains, and runs this place. If it's not God, because he's absent from that, then it's some other God. And how do we reconcile that? So I don't know. It's an interesting concept.
And well, speaking about the thing that you mentioned earlier about how the mother would go to hell with her son, it's sort of reminds me of another thing that comes up in inclusivist conversations sometimes about, I'm trying to remember what it was. It wasn't Columbus, but it was some Columbus-esque figure who had gone to South America, and they were, killing people that had belonged to a certain tribe because they were taking over the land, basically. And they said to one of the guys, one of the chiefs, I think it was, before they burned him at the stake, they said, hey, repent and turn to Jesus so that you can go to heaven. And he said, are Christians in heaven? And they said, yeah. Then I'm not going to do that. You can just burn me and I'm going to go to the other place. And because I don't want to be with you guys, that would be horrible. And so obviously in those kinds of situations, you would think God would take all that into account and say, oh, it makes perfect sense that you would think that heaven would be hell for you and hell would be heaven. It's the opposite of what a lot of people are throwing out. Yeah.
I tell you what, all of this is it's so good, man. I appreciate you coming and hanging out with us. John, any parting thoughts before I I say goodbye to our friend.
Just,
It's after 1 o'clock in the morning in Spain. He's probably,
really, yeah.
although he had a nap. That is good.
That's true. And if I can close with a quote from Thomas Talbot, who's a better author than me, and he's a philosopher, I'll read that. And, yeah. So he wrote this book called The Inescapable Love of God, which I think is good. So I'll just read a quick quote from him. If supreme power lies on the side of supreme love, then none of us, whether Christian, Muslim, or even atheists, need fear that the one who loved us into existence in the first place might wantonly abandon us in the end. Nor need we worry that an honest mistake in abstract theology will somehow jeopardize our future. For if a perfectly loving creator does exist, then he knows us from the inside out far better than we know ourselves. He appreciates the ambiguities, the confusions, and the perplexities we face far better than we do. And he understands the historical and cultural factors that shape our beliefs better than any historian does. Such a creator, so loving, intimate, and wise, would know how to work with each of us in infinitely complex ways, how to shatter our illusions and transform our thinking when necessary, and how best to reveal himself to us in the end.
So amazing.
Universalism.
Yeah. I'll leave you with one parting thought as well. And I don't have any quotes, but I remember very well the first time I read John Chrysostom's Paschal Homily. That is as universalist a text as you'll ever read from a church father. And I don't think he was one. There's other places he writes sort of, but his Paschal Homily is essentially Christ as total victor over every single facet of life, death, hell, the grave. And he's essentially addresses it to like everybody, like, if, essentially talking about how death was embittered when it tasted of the flesh of Jesus because it knew it had been defeated and it gave up its dead. And it's so there's this whole tradition in Christian church prior to, what we've done to it, where the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus was seen as a complete and total victory of God over sin, hell, death, and the grave. So whatever we thought had been, whether or not we see that victory manifested every single day, it hinted at this universal victory of God over death. And it left no one out. I mean, he addresses this to those who are sinners, those who are saints, those who are what. If you read it, it's only like 8 or 10 paragraphs. It's very short. But I used to read it at Easter when I was the short time that I pastored a little church. And I'm like, that's my Easter message. I got nothing else to say that's better than this. This day is a proclamation and a reiteration of the fact that Jesus utterly defeated death on this day, and we have nothing left to fear. And that's the message of the gospel for me, more so than, again, a lot of times what's portrayed and what's presented as the gospel, which is, fear tactics and, turn or burn type stuff. But anyway, again, say thank you so much. I appreciate you hanging out and talking to us into the early hours of the morning there in Madrid.
Yeah, no problem.
Don't forget the latest book is Christ Saves All: Christian Universalist Perspectives, available now. I'm guessing is it on?
Yeah,
okay,
so on Amazon,
wherever fine books are sold, you can certainly avail yourself of Jeff Bezos' contraption called Amazon. Sadly, I'm a choir author too, and I know I need people to buy on Amazon. It helps the algorithms and the ratings and all this stuff, but and it's unlikely any local bookstores or Barnes and Noble is going to carry my book. But that being said, it is available. You should buy it and connect up with Steven wherever he's connectable, man. So we appreciate you. Best of luck to you with that.
Pretty much YouTube, yeah. Well, thanks so much.
YouTube. I forgot. Yeah, the YouTube channel is called what's it called again?
Love Unrelenting. Yeah, that's
Love Unrelenting. Is that a YouTube channel, podcast?
It's a YouTube channel. Yeah, if you like David Bentley Hart, there's a full documentary about David Bentley Hart on there. If you like theological questions, there are documentaries on there. Short clips, long clips, hour and 40 minutes, sometimes 2 minutes. So anyway, yeah, Love Unrelenting. You can check it out.
All right, check it out. We'll make sure and post links to those in the show notes as well. So we'll try and drive some traffic that way.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.